Gustav Vasa I, the father of Sweden, the great reformer, a bloodthirsty tyrant, a chronic backstabber and opportunist. You can call him many things, but his story and our story begins in the year 520, from the 7th to the 9th November, where Vasa and a lot of other nobles had been invited to the capital of the Swedish kingdom by the newly crowned King Christian II, the Danish king that had been crowned now the Swedish king, and ruler of the entire Kalmarunion. Christian II had invited most of Swedish high nobility and other important men of the realm to a feast to celebrate his coronation as now the new king. Though this would turn out to have been a trap, as the event turned out to have been a ploy in order to gather most of the important men of Sweden in one place in order to execute them. Among these people also the father of Gustav Vasa, Erik Johansson Vasa. A betrayal, and it would not be the first betrayal in this story, as you will see betrayals a lot in the story of Gustav Vasa. In any case, the event turned out to become a massacre of about 100 noblemen and other important people, known today as Stockholm Blodbad or the bloodbath in Stockholm. However, one of the intended noblemen to be killed escaped, a man known as Gustav Eriksson of the Vasa family, later known as Gustav Vasa I of Sweden, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. This man, Gustav Vasa, fled to the region of Dalarna on skis, back and forth between various towns and villages, in order to rouse a rebellion against Christian II, who had ordered the execution of his father. And this is also the background behind the national Vasa ski race in Sweden, in particular Vasa's journey between Mora to Sälen, as he tried to gather support for a rebellion against Christian II, agitating against Christian II among the peasants, arguing that Christian II would raise taxes upon them, take away their independence and act against God, and maybe even change the religion from Catholicism to Protestantism. Remember these points, because they are going to be important later. A little bit of context to these accusations of Christian II trying to impose Protestantism is that Denmark's king Christian II had attempted to reform the church, though still staying within the Catholic Church, and various reforms to make changes in the Catholic Church locally would be continued under Frederick I in Denmark. But the Reformation in Denmark to real Protestantism away from the Catholic Church and breaking the ties with the papal seat in Rome was brought to Denmark by King Christian III, who had converted to Protestantism and decreed in 1536 that Denmark would be a Lutheran kingdom. That was Christian III, but Christian II himself was one of the first reformers with regards to the position of the Church of Denmark, and he had made steps that would later be taken in a much more radical direction by later kings. In any case, Gustav Vasa managed to incite a rebellion that started in Dalarna and got the support later of several other regions that joined him against Christian II, making several regions to rise up in rebellion against Christian II. He also got the support of the Hansa Trade League, or the Hanseatic League, a trade network organization of various city-states and rich commercial interests that were against Christian II and who gave Gustav Vasa favorable loans. In return, he promised the Hanseatic League to later pay back the loans and to keep the trading rights with the Hansa and to expand them and weaken Denmark, which had been a thorn in the side of the Hanseatic League even before the time of Christian II. He also managed to get a lot of local religious support as well, as the current archbishop, Gustav Eriksson Trolle, was very hated, and he was one of the primary supporters of Christian II, and thus his association was used as a rallying cry against Christian II. Through the means to finance and equip troops, mercenaries paid by the Hansa, and manpower in the form of popular support and religious support in a Catholic Church that was largely divided against Gustav Eriksson Trolle and Christian II,
and due to upset nobility over the bloodbath massacre.
Vasa managed to win this rebellion against Christian II. In 1523, and becomes the king of an independent Sweden, which had not been the case since the early 14th century that Sweden was independent. As Gustav Vasa's victory against Christian II in the rebellion against him led to the final dissolution of the Kalmarunion, the union that had united Sweden, Norway and Denmark into one political entity. Now that Gustav Vasa had won against Christian II, it was now time to pay the loans to the Hansa and to keep the promises of strengthening the Catholic piety within the Swedish realm, which Gustav Vasa more or less immediately disregarded and instead decided to convert to Lutheran Protestantism and thus convert the entirety of Sweden to that faith, claiming that he had found that true piety was lying in the interpretation of Christianity that the Lutherans had proposed. And thus, just like Paul, he had had a true change of heart regarding his beliefs and faith, and now saw it as his pious mission to convert the realm to this true faith out of the purity of his beliefs. And this had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that it made the local churches and their wealth fall under the jurisdiction of the crown directly, as the king is the head of the church in the Protestant tradition, and thus letting him confiscate the wealth and take it for himself. Absolutely nothing to do with that. It was a true change of heart. And his confiscation of all the church treasury in Sweden was absolutely not to enrich himself, but only to make the church live more frugally. And in order to ensure that these reforms to Protestantism lasted, he had to do a brutal repression and suppression of any Catholic opposition. And in this, he was supported by the Hansa and German mercenaries, who he had promised large payments and spoils to in return for support against these rebellions against him, that he promised that he would pay once these rebellions were over, that is to say later, and we will be coming back to this. But it should be mentioned that a lot of this opposition had previously supported Gustav Vasa in order to preserve Catholicism and get rid of Gustav Eriksson Trolle, who was seen as ungodly within the Catholic Church, as being a radical reformer. Though still Catholic and not a Protestant, he was still seen as being un-Catholic. And Gustav Vasa had promised to return Sweden to the good old Catholic ways. So it was a pretty major betrayal in their view that Gustav Vasa had done. But Gustav Vasa managed to beat down most of these rebellions pretty handily. Though it should be said that after having won against Christian II and having had to do these reforms of the church away from Catholicism to the Lutheran interpretation of Christianity, and due to all the loans he had taken and were needed to be repaid, Gustav Vasa also took away a lot of the local independence of the Swedish regions and raised taxes, things he had promised to the various groups in Sweden not to do. So several regions in Sweden rebelled against Gustav Vasa and his betrayal of his oaths to not infringe on their independence and to not raise taxes. And the regions that rebelled included Dalarna, where his entire rebellion against Christian II had started. But the worst rebellion would happen by peasants in Småland, in southern Sweden, who rebelled in 1542, fueled by grievances over taxes and the church reforms and the confiscation of church bells and vestments. For several months, this uprising caused Gustav severe difficulties in that the rebels were hiding in the dense forests where they could easily ambush his forces. This is the so-called Dackefejd, or the conflict with Dacke, or Dacke Rebellion, the largest of the rebellions and conflicts during Sweden's turn to Protestantism. And Vasa, during this conflict, sent a letter to certain people of the province of Dalarna, requesting that they should circulate letters to every Swedish province, stating their support for the king with their troops and urging every other province to do the same. Gustav got his troops among those Swedish persons that had embraced the Lutheran Protestant faith, with whose help, and not least, with the Hanseatic paid German mercenaries that he had promised yet again later payment, he managed to defeat the rebels in the spring of 1543 through promising a part of the rebels clemency and concessions on his side in exchange for them to lay down their weapons. He managed to divide the rebels and eventually defeat them. And, as it should probably be of no surprise, he did not keep his word to those rebels he had promised concessions, and when he was done with the Daco rebellion, he allowed his mercenary troops to slaughter them and to plunder various towns and villages in Småland as payment. Thus, he had paid off a part of the mercenary force. However, through using his Protestant support troops and compensating certain mercenaries with various privileges and titles, and the uproar caused by the brutality of the mercenaries that had ransacked Småland, he actually managed to politically outmaneuver parts of his mercenary force in such a way that he avoided paying them anything and actually confiscated what they had taken from Småland and sent them away from Sweden empty-handed. So Gustav Vasa managed to also betray a part of the mercenary forces that had fought for him. And as for the Hansa Trade League that he had promised to repay his loans to once everything was over, and the lucrative Hansa trade that he promised to not tax, well, it is pretty obvious what he did next, is it not? He ignored paying the Hansa loans and actually broke the trading rights with the Hansa and taxed them. So Gustav Vasa had managed to not only betray the peasants that had initially supported him, and then betray the Catholic Church and the people that supported Catholicism by converting to Protestantism, and then also betray a large section of the mercenaries that had fought for Gustav Vasa for most of his campaigns against both Christian II and later against various rebellions against Gustav Vasa. And finally now also betraying the Hanseatic League that had paid for his rebellion against Christian II and also paid him various favorable loans in order that he could secure his throne. And now Gustav Vasa was relying upon various radical Lutheran Protestant groups in order to secure his throne and the stability of his family dynasty on the throne. And of course, Gustav Vasa would never do anything to betray these new supporters, would he? Okay, this is a joke. Because Gustav Vasa also managed to get one of his sons, Johan III, married to a Polish Catholic princess with the name Katarina Jagiellonica after lengthy negotiations from 1526 to 1555, which would eventually end up with marriage in 1562, 2 years after Gustav Vasa's death. And also further down the line, being married into the ruling Polish nobility, and due to some very convenient deaths and political events, the Vasa family would manage to get Gustav Vasa's grandson Sigismund into the position of King of Poland and of Sweden for a brief while, controlling both kingdoms under one united Vasa family. In any case, these marriage negotiations with the Polish Jagiellonica family that were Catholics would also lead into various concessions made by Gustav Vasa regarding the Catholic Church. And these concessions, together with the fact that Gustav Vasa had decided that his clan would marry into a Catholic family, caused a great uproar among his Protestant supporters. But, as we know about Gustav Vasa, he was not a man with a principled behavior, except in the way that he usually treats those that he saw as becoming a liability in certain ways. So he decided to crack down on a lot of the radical Protestants that he had previously been supported by, and thus leaving a vacuum that would later cause religious conflicts when people tried to reconvert Sweden to Catholicism later, after his death on the 29th of September 1560, leaving his sons Eric XIV, Johan III, and Karl IX to fight for the crown. His sons were, well, let's just say that if Gustav Vasa could be considered ruthless, then, well, let's just say his sons were definitely not less ruthless. Yeah, that will be a video for the future to discuss. But despite this video having spoken so much about how Gustav Vasa managed to betray everyone and anyone that supported him, it is important to note that Gustav Vasa, through these actions and through his extreme charisma that has even been described as devilish charisma, managed to strengthen the Swedish state to the degree you could even begin to actually talk about a state rather than a Swedish territory with various local political powers that are only in name only under a Swedish crown or state. Gustav Vasa managed to eliminate this fractured nature of the Swedish realm to a large degree by eliminating various minor powers and centers of power within the Swedish realm, through which many of these rebellions I spoke of in this video were connected to. And he managed to create Swedish independence from Denmark by defeating Christian II and dissolving the Kalmarunion, and laid the foundations for what would come afterwards in Swedish history, with the Great Power Era and the Swedish Empire in many regards. And through converting to Protestantism, he also created the Swedish Church, which culturally has formed the Swedish identity and the Swedish culture for hundreds of years. Gustav Vasa taking power is also seen in Swedish history as the definite end of the Swedish medieval period and the beginning of early modern Sweden. And this is the bloody father of Sweden, Gustav Vasa, the ruthless, backstabbing king that created early modern Sweden, but began as a fugitive and rebel against another king, after having fled a massacre, which I have described in another video. Also, please give likes if you like this video, and also post questions and comments. I love to read and respond to them.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.